And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course our original mothership at coalitionradio.us. Really, tonight strikes my comeback, if you will, post-election. For those of folks who've met me or know me, understand that I'm involved in a number of different projects in the Libertarian Party, not the least of which was the Joe Jorgensen Spike Cohen campaign. But that election is behind us. We'll talk about that a little bit tonight with our special guest. He is, in fact, what we call a repeat offender here on the Coalition. Connor Drigotas has been with us for a couple of years now, incredibly enough, giving us a unique perspective on communications, their importance, the role, and what we'll talk about tonight is the closing week, if you will, of the election, and then the impact of the madness that seems to await us. Connor is a professor at Lehigh University. Incredibly enough, he is a graduate both of Lafayette College and Lehigh University. He serves a public relations role in industry-leading liberty action groups and corporations. So in addition to teaching, and he is also an author, and I'm hoping to get him in under a new format on a couple of times a month. Next week, we're going to be talking about his latest release. I can't wait for. I'm reading the book as we speak. This is the first time I've had a chance to actually read something that has really nothing to do with the words press and release. And it's as hard-hitting and honest as this day is long. Connor, welcome back to the Coalition. It's great to see someone from the real world.
Yeah, I can only imagine. You've been on the road for a while, so please, if anything, welcome back to you.
Welcome back to planet Earth. Although I'm not sure if what we define now is planet Earth at all. Talk to me about, if you will, this segue, this horrible segue that we're going through from the last days of the election. Really, from the point in time that President Trump became ill and seemingly lost his mind, even by Trumper status, on up to where we are right now. What am I wrong in characterizing it as this sort of flailing about that's taking place?
No, I think that's a really accurate way to put it. I mean, Donald Trump really tried to appeal to a very specific kind of person throughout his campaign, which I would define as his base, exactly the type of person who he thought was going to carry him through the election. And it really turns out that there just weren't as many of those folks as perhaps some of the media coverage might have made him think. But, that's what happens when you don't listen to the data, when you're listening to limited sources to make decisions. It's a great business lesson. And I guess a lot of folks are wishing the guy who is all about making the deal and being a business expert could have made a better business decision to appeal to more people.
Right. As someone pointed out somewhat poignantly, if you're my age, that the available supply of white European men between the age of 55 and infinity is starting to narrow sharply. There is no new supply of us available, and that would appear to be a significant part of the Trump appeal. That sort of, I'm frustrated, I'm lost, I don't believe in society's institutions anymore. I want someone who's going to speak the truth, and I think the underlying message was make me feel better. Now let me ask you about that too. Is that a cliche? Am I giving voice to a cliche that Trump supporters were those lost souls in the current generation who society, if you will, after living a life and having goals and expectations, society has changed, the disruptions have betrayed them? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think maybe the demographic was right. I'm always curious to see a lot of what Donald Trump has talked about is, pay attention to your 401k, right? And your 401k, a lot of his voters were financial folks who did really, really well financially over the last 4 years. And that group, by and large, tended to be older and white. In other words, Donald Trump was banking on more people having something to lose under a Joe Biden presidency. I would argue, certainly for worse, for a myriad of reasons. This isn't even a political statement, but 2020 hasn't been the year of prosperity generally, culturally, that Donald Trump needed it to be. Between COVID, between the civil unrest, there were so many factors there that it became very hard to have a marketing slogan like "Keep America Great," when realistically, I think people are struggling. We need to admit that, and Trump would have done well to pivot quite a bit to say, hey, we actually still have some work to do. Keep America great when people are worried about putting food on the table isn't a message that the majority of Americans are going to be able to relate to. It's much broader than that.
So we move forward to the closing days of the election. Ironically, his hopes seem to be entirely rooted in the quote unquote vaccine, the one that he missed by 6 days. Would that have made the difference, do you think? If all of a sudden he had been out there last Monday, with his arms around the CEO of Pfizer, who by the way seems to have steered. There's a whole lesson plan that we could develop on how the gentleman from Pfizer has managed to steer through these political crosscurrents. But would that have changed? Would that have been enough?
I don't think it would have. That's just one guy's opinion, but at the end of the day, I believe that you would have needed to have seen some results. People love hope. It's a relatable thing if there's, something on the horizon, but after getting beat up for the last 9, 10, 11 months, depending on when Corona really started in each individual person's life, there needed to be a very demonstrable benefit to have occurred. The polls showed this out, but Trump in the first debate came out blustering. He talked too much, didn't let Joe Biden shoot himself in the foot. I think that Trump seemed to have learned a lot between the first and second debates, but maybe it's that same lesson that should have been applied more broadly. Get out there, show people what you've done. Don't just rely on this messaging, which again, it's not relatable. People can't relate to someone like Donald Trump at a time like this.
Well, it's interesting too, because despite all the notions of what he did, allegedly, there are holes abounding in that. I mean, one of the reasons why 401ks have flourished is because since the middle of last year, the Trump administration has been involved in a quantitative easing. Well, they would never call it that, but have been pumping money, like you read about, into the financial markets, which is predictably had an impact. Laws of economics are like laws of physics. You pump a lot of money into a money supply, then it will inflate the price of market traded assets. If you look to the tax cut, folks are smart enough to see, on the horizon, these enormous deficits. They simply didn't cut the budget when they cut certain taxes. And yes, there were some great offsets from that, but the foreign policy wins. I mean, so many of them had been. First of all, it was too little, too late. Is the dear leader, was getting up, and the discomfort so many Americans had with the notion of getting into bed with someone from the North Korean regime as well as the Russian regime. Was there any real substance? I'm not trying to get into the issues per se, but was his flailing around predicated on the realization that most of his assumptions were, built on houses of sand?
That's such an interesting way to put it, built on houses of sand, because, I'm not an economist at the end of the day, but what I can say is that as a layman, I do every once in a while take a look at that debt clock, and it makes me really nervous. It makes me really nervous because I'm worried about my own future kids. I'm worried about my grandkids. I'm worried about, quite frankly, my brothers and my parents who are closer to retirement and what that looks like for them. And when I look at Donald Trump's achievements, there were so many things that, again, dollars to cents, not looking at the economic impact in the long term, but actually saying, hey, was I better off 3 years ago than I was at the beginning of 2020? I think for many people, the answer would have been yes. the money was feeling good. The country was, just the normal amount of crazy. 2020 just really threw a hard left hook to Donald Trump, and he did not handle it well. He didn't bring over the people that he needed to bring over from the center. And I think that's such a different thing, right? We talk so much in marketing about defining your audience and trying to make sure that you're talking to the right people. And Donald Trump, again, just continued to hammer on this very narrow segment of people, regardless of their age, gender, demographic, whatever. He was talking to his strongest base instead of making inroads to the people who were at that point making a decision about who they were going to vote for. Joe Biden was not likable. He was weird. He was uncomfortable to watch in so many situations. For all the optimism people had about him early on, I kind of looked at it and I was very bullish on Donald Trump all the way up until probably middle of the summer of 2020, when I started to see the cracks really show through, because even the people who really like Donald Trump started to say things like, he probably shouldn't have done that. Man, this isn't feeling good. And if your core supporters are at least starting to question what's going on, that means you've already lost so much of the rest of America.
And then you had that strange pivot where all of a sudden it's almost as if they'd, I don't know what they fed Mr. Biden, where he just became the kinder, gentler old man again. And in contrast to this collective nervous breakdown the Trump administration seemed to be having, by that moment when he threw off the mask off the ceiling like El Duce, if you will, if that crazy, parade around, that motorcade around to show everybody that, he wasn't going to take Corona lying down. I just think people just got freaked out finally. As creepy as Joe Biden can be, and if you're a libertarian or a liberty person or a liberty Republican, you understand just how damaging he's been over a lifetime of actual legislation, real behavior, not just imaging. All of a sudden, he became the good guy. How does a campaign allow that transition to take place? Or were they just along for the ride at this point? Were they just?
Are you saying how did the Democrats allow that to happen, or are you saying how did the Republicans not react enough?
First of all, the Republicans, and I kind of know the answer because I don't think at this point there's anything you could tell Donald Trump to do. But you've got sophisticated political operatives at the helm of the Trump campaign. Is he just so incorrigible that you can't have that come to Jesus meeting with him that says, stop it? Stop the madness?
I don't think anybody could get through to Donald Trump. I mean, if you're looking at Donald Trump even today, right? I, for better or worse, follow him on Twitter, and I'm constantly getting hammered with his messaging. And his messaging is not relatable to someone who, quite frankly, my wife is an emergency room nurse. I care about what's happening during this pandemic, and I feel it very personally. When I see someone who doesn't seem to have a great plan, who doesn't seem to be putting the principles of liberty first, and let's be honest, Donald Trump is not putting the principles of liberty first. I don't see how people like me could go out and support him. Obviously, I am libertarian, right? I'm not a Republican going out and pulling the lever for Donald Trump, no matter what here. But there was at least at some point a conversation that was, do you have to vote for one of the two major parties because you think that they're going to accomplish something real? Obviously, for me personally, I have no problem saying that's not the way that it broke for me, and I voted for a third party happily. But there was an opportunity there that was completely missed. And before we jump on to anything else, I want to say too how libertarians generally and folks who care about liberty, a Joe Biden presidency with a Republican-controlled Senate and conservatives in the Supreme Court, it's not a bad place to be. Mm-hmm. The biggest thing that we need to worry about right now is the administrative state. We need to worry about what our unelected bureaucrats are doing behind the scenes to make policy changes and impact our day-to-day lives. But the government structures in a constitutional sense, having those checks and balances in place, that in and of itself is not the worst thing for liberty that could have happened.
Right, particularly in a government that at least has some sensible respect for checks and balances, as opposed to I don't even know what you call the last 4 years. In 4 years, I was on a show earlier today, and I commented that as a libertarian, I'm not particularly in love with all these governmental institutions, but to a certain degree, those governmental institutions, whether it be how we vote, when we vote, how Congress interacts, how we nominate Supreme Court justice, that's been sort of the duct tape that's held together this fractious group of people for a couple hundred years now. And those have been ripped off the scab, if you will, of the American people at this point. There's literally nothing left after 4 years. He's pretty much taken it all down, hasn't he?
He really has. And I do want to point out, it's an interesting thing because Donald Trump is such a polarizing figure, but the pieces have been in place for quite a while. I put out an op-ed a couple weeks ago about how the left and the right have both been pushed to the brink. And I don't really mean that in terms of the political right and left. I'm talking about everyday people. The easiest comparison that I could find was the militia in Michigan on the right-hand side who sought to overthrow the Michigan state government and install their own institutions versus the folks in CHOP and Chaz in Seattle who really tried to do very much the same thing. I'd argue they had a quite a bit more success. But at the end of it, really what both the right and the left people are trying to do is they're forced to pursue peace through force. And unfortunately, that's not because that's the easiest path forward. It's because the American people generally are facing various forms of violence in the form of mass incarceration and in terms of so many laws on the books that people feel backed into a corner. That's not what I want for my neighbors. That's not what I want for my family. That's not what I want for my friends. But when I look around, it seems to be more and more common that people are being actively harmed by the policies that are being put into place at the highest levels. And at some point, people are going to start pushing back. I think it is disgusting, but I don't think that it's surprising.
Right. Now let's move forward now. All of a sudden it's election week and, things aren't going well. So you could have a fireside chat with the American people to explain your perspective in the final days of the campaign, or you could stand at every street corner imaginable inciting your what's the hashtag I saw last week now? It seems to be everywhere. Cult 45. If you could be inspiring the Cult 45 to, and this is what's crazy to me. The Trumpers had seen themselves as sort of the last bastions of American traditional conservatism. Now you've got them literally engaging in these protests, and Bill Clinton couldn't get a reaction like this out of these people, and the sheer the insanity of their reaction, and they're being spoon-fed. It is, or am I overreacting? Is it a cult? Look at some of the people you see on TV.
Yeah,
what's happening here?
People are getting upset. People are getting torn up, and it's the result of government having so much power over our day-to-day lives. There is something to lose right now by losing the White House, by losing various congressional races. People genuinely can point to policies where they say, if this person gets into office or if this party is in power, there's going to be consequences to that in my day-to-day life, whether that's laws being passed that are harmful to one group or another, or just an empowerment of certain groups. What we're missing in all this, which is I would say much more important, is that if the people in Washington can impact your day-to-day life that much, it's the positions themselves that simply have too much power. We need to take power back through the 10th Amendment, through constitutional principles, and empower our communities, rebuild our institutions, We don't need a social safety net at the federal level. We need a social safety net at the local level where it's not tied up in bureaucracy and can actually help people. So yes, it's a cult, but it's coming from a place of genuine fear. There's just a misdiagnosis of what the actual problem is. It's not the right or the left. It's the right and the left working together against we the people.
Now let's flash forward to Tuesday night. It's not going well. It's just, and you've got a sophisticated machine who's monitoring, states across the nation, that's being driven data from the most local level. They've got to know that, in the words of the immortal philosopher, ruh-roh, we got a problem here. And so at what point in time does a group of wealthy, successful, I'm imagining the fairly sophisticated, well-educated individuals decide to have a collective nervous breakdown, and that the best option was to start screaming like stuck school children about this variety of real and mostly imagined events?
I think the most telling thing about that is I'm actually not sure which side you're referencing right now. There's a lot of people who have been crying over this last week on both the right and the left, which has been worrisome because there have been a tremendous number of threats, a tremendous number of violent incidents. Is it because the stakes are too high? Is it because the politicians actually matter? I'm not sure, but that in and of itself is concerning to me.
And the specter of the media. I mean, I don't usually have time. I'm too immersed in the reality of these situations. I don't have time to sit and ponder the talking heads at CNN or Fox. For whatever reason, it was just easier for me to watch CNN. Wow, they're terrible. And here I am. They're just terrible. This guy Cuomo, they spent 2 days of my life. And I'm glued to it, obviously, right? I mean, this is,
of course,
when you're pals with the vice president's candidate of the third largest political party in the country, you got stake, you got skin in the game, so you're watching, and so I'm watching for any reporting whatsoever on the third party and other parties. There's none of it, and I'm watching the entire machine of CNN be focused continually on explaining avenues for Joe Biden to win. Mm-hmm. I can understand now why so many Trump supporters are just so pissed off at the media, because the assumption was, if you were going in to that night, that Trump's a terrible human being. Okay, he kind of is, but does that mean that a news organization is focused on his personality? Or should they be just reporting the news and at least entertain the thought that, there are some states that are in play and that he's winning? I watched them talk about Wisconsin over and over and over again, pointing out the towns that were going to go for Biden. Fait accompli. Oh, my God. I had no idea it was this bad. Well, as a communication specialist, as someone who lives the spoken word and lives the transmission of ideas, do you watch this stuff? Can you bring yourself to watch it?
Pat, Christmas is coming, and I think I'm going to mail you a universal remote. I don't know what kind of TV you have, but we're going to get you to turn that thing off because it's heartbreaking and it eats us alive. We spend so much time, and to be honest, I'm a cord cutter. I got rid of cable. I do not enjoy it. I do not like it, but I was still streaming different channels. I was still connected on social media, at least for that first 24 to 48 hours. You have to be plugged in if you're someone who cares about the future of the country. From a communications perspective, it doesn't surprise me at all that CNN took that approach, because at the end of the day, CNN's job, let's be real, it's not to provide honest news. It's to make money as a media company. And regardless of, of course, journalistic standards, and this is across the board, this isn't just CNN, you'd hope that journalists would pursue a higher goal, that they would do something. really admirable and report in a neutral, unbiased way. But that's not where we're at right now. The most empowering thing that we can do is find sources that we can trust. A lot of them are going to be smaller, localer, decentralized groups. And I think that's a win for both the right, the left, and liberty, independent of any party. Local news is going to make a big difference. And that's going to be hard, especially, I'm not saying local news channels. I'm saying independent podcast shows like yours that, are real people talking. That's where you're going to get real unbiased opinions, is because they're actually dealing in reality. And it's not generally something that's just a pursuit of trying to feed a bottom line. Not that there's anything wrong with feeding a bottom line, but let's not conflate that this is, or try to imagine that this is some unbiased organization trying to feed us information.
Yeah, I tend to go now to websites like FEE and AIER and the Goldwater Group, who's actually quite advanced in if you will, bringing a journalistic aspect to a knowledge-based website. And quite frankly, organizations like that are doing a spectacular job of framing the news and questioning it and bringing to bear great minds. And obviously I'm going to be biased, and there are organizations like that. I mean, but that on who are left of center. But I go to the ACLU's website all the time, and I read about cases and things like that. So I think folks, if I were to prescribe an intervention for America, not only would it be to cut the cord, but just give up on CNN and Fox. Just say no mas, and step away from the from the remote and just walk away and try and find newspapers, news organizations that are just really almost academic.
Absolutely.
There's some great ones out there. And Goldwater, by the way, comes to mind just because of their realpolitik emphasis on a lot of the news and a lot of the questions and challenges that face the country. All right, so now we're into now, and I hate this analogy, but unfortunately it's apt. One can't, one is a student of history, can't think about Trump hiding out like a certain mid-20th century political figure in the bunker. I'm not going to use the word. I'm not going to compare him to that. That to me is grotesque when people do that, because he is not. I don't like him. In fact, I loathe him politically, but he is not of that ilk. But at the same time, from a communication standpoint, isn't that the feeling you get?
He's a man alone. He's isolated. His allies are giving up on him. And don't get me wrong, I still believe there's a chance that Donald Trump wins this in the courts, or that some evidence comes to light that results in a second term. However, I think it's a very long shot. And at this point, I don't think it would be healthy for America. If I'm being completely honest, when Thursday hit, I disappeared into the woods to go hunting for the weekend. I had planned this ahead of time to try to escape from this feeling. And, in some ways, I feel very badly for a lot of the politicos in Washington. I feel bad for Joe Biden. I feel bad for Donald Trump, because they had to sit there and they had to deal with this, and they are continuing to deal with what is a contested election and likely will be into December, in my opinion. I think that this doesn't get worked out for a long time in the courts. And when it does, the only thing that we can really hope for is that it's a peaceful transition of power, or a peaceful concession, depending on which way it goes. And that our friends and neighbors remember that we are, in fact, friends and neighbors. We're all Americans. And that means putting principles above politics and putting people above politics, and staying away from the factions that, from our very first day in existence, factions were predicted to be what tore this country apart. We have to beat it back, and we have to be aware that is the danger we're up against.
Well, Bill Clinton's contribution to all of this was ending the notion that any one politician was not as big as the quote unquote greater good. You go back to the Profumo affair, and for the good of the Queen, you stepped away, regardless of your guilt. There's a certain. I've always wondered. There's a certain former senator in Colorado who had a very poorly named, what was it called, the monkey business, his boat, and he was the last American politician to just step away because, for the quote unquote greater good, for good of God and good of the country. And that ended with Bill Clinton. In fact, now the textbook play is just to bowl through it and do what, in a sense, Trump is doing on the grandest stage of all, which is to maintain one's mission until literally he cannot any longer. We are at a time in American history where we've got an internal challenge in the form of this pandemic, and then we've got serious foreign policy issues, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, on and on, the resurgence of radical Islam in Afghanistan, or I should say the violent resurgence of it, it's naive to think that those folks won't take advantage of this vacuum. I'm surprised they haven't done it yet. I fear for some type, and I'm not trying to be, the stakes I have in 9/11. I lost friends on 9/11. I don't say this lightly, but there are people who wish us extreme ill, and in this vacuum of power could take advantage of that. At a certain point, shouldn't Donald Trump do what's right for the country?
Absolutely. He's going to need to. This isn't something that and either of the candidates should take lightly because the implications are quite a bit larger. Me, I tend to be a glass half full type of person. I try my hardest to be optimistic about these sorts of things, regardless of how bleak it looks. And I guess the one thing that I would say now from that glass half full perspective is what an amazing time to be talking about liberty, because there are opportunities to make friends on the right and there are opportunities to make friends on the left, because they are both so embattled with each other that people who care about liberty are really a lesser concern. Now's the time that we reach out about criminal justice reform, decriminalization of drugs, help people get back on the path to prosperity, lower the national debt, find those allies and look for solutions. What they do at the highest levels, let's be real, we have very little control over it. Reinvest in your communities, reinvest in the people who surround you every single day. And if we're all doing that, this country is going to heal regardless of what those idiots at the top end up doing at the end of the day.
And that's why we have you on the show, because while I'm losing my collective mind over all of this, and I was screaming, what's the rant from Groundhog Day? Dogs and cats, cats and dogs, right? While I'm doing that, there you go again, Connor Drigotas, just leveling the entire conversation with one broad stroke, pointing to an emotional maturity that clearly your host does not possess. It's like playing tennis, folks. I play tennis against people that are better than I am. I engage in rhetoric with people who are smarter, and in this case, cooler heads are prevailing. You, of course, are absolutely correct, because people of goodwill can, I think, summon up a collective disgust. There, that collective word again, right? A collective disgust with other folks on high, and say, you know what? Screw them. Let's get down to business. Let's work out something ourselves and find solutions ourselves. And just while they're going nuts over there, while the toddlers are, fighting over who gets to play with the new toy, we'll just change the world. And of course, you're right. Damn you.
Hey, we've got work to do, and I'm hoping, we're going to be able to do a lot of great things together. And, that's the reason why we do this program and why we talk to people, right? Is because every single day we're looking for allies to build amazing things and make the world a little bit more of a better place.
Well, you've got a new book. It's called Work for Liberty. We were going to talk about it this week, and then again, I desperately want this election to go away just so I can return to some semblance of normality and do the work I truly love to do. Although, I'm attracted to that flame of this madness, like any other working political activist. It's intriguing. It's intoxicating. It's insulting, all of that at the same time. But we are going to get back to work next week. I hope to have you on at the same time spot. It'd be great to have you on a couple times a month in this time spot, because I predict that we are in for a deluge, if you will, of news, challenges, opportunities, events, initiatives, movements. All of that is going to happen, I think, on a grander scale, because the spinning top that is this world is not slowing down, is it? It's almost hyperventilating. It's reaching increasingly new speeds in terms of the news cycle and in terms of the events that propel the news cycle. And do you see it slowing down anytime soon?
No, sir. There's more social media outlets every single day. There's more places, and it's a millisecond news cycle. It's coming fast. And
as always, I admire your skill in stepping back and making the keen observation. I am blessed on this show to have met a dozen or so people, and to me, this is the ultimate testament, who answer questions that haven't even been asked yet. And that's what's great about a conversational format like this. Folks, you can find Connor Drigotas at ConnerDrigotas.com. You'll see op-eds, you'll see books, you'll see thought. Now imagine that. For all you folks who claim to detest the events of the past few months, you have the opportunity here. You can go to ConnerDrigotas.com and you can essentially relax, have a cup of something soothing, maybe with a little kick to it, maybe an adult beverage, and then actually engage in the type of thought that you claim, the important part here, you claim to want to engage in. And you can do that at ConnerDrigotas.com. What do you got coming up, buddy? We'll talk about the book next week, but what else are you working on? Anything you can spill the beans on?
I'd say the next big thing is not just the book, but building a community around the book. We have just under 100 people in a Discord server that launched along with the book, and the sole purpose of that group is just to help each other find jobs working for liberty. So it's an ambitious project, but we've already helped a bunch of people so far, and we're just getting started.
Excellent. And that's what we'll talk about next week. That's the big tease for next week. Working for Liberty by ConnerDrigotas.com. Hey, buddy, listen, thanks again for joining us, working through our little restart here on the coalition. And hold on tight. We're in for a bumpy ride, aren't we?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Pat. Glad to have you back.
All right, buddy. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course, coalitionradionetwork.com, where joining us in the next segment is Jessie Sage. She'll be joining us in just a couple minutes. We are running late, as we always seem to be. That's the fault of your host, not the technically skilled array of individuals supporting this broadcast. But stay tuned for a couple minutes, and we will be back to close out the evening with, I think, what's going to be a very provocative conversation. Stay tuned. We'll be back.